Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Most everybody now in the United States knows it was the fourth Republican presidential debate was held last night on News Nation. And there was a bunch of fireworks, especially between Vivek Ramaswamy and Nikki Haley. We'll get to that in just a second. And as we've talked about before in the pregame show that we released a little bit yesterday before it, the real elephant that was not in the room was Donald Trump. We're going to get to that too. But to help us break down what happened and what's likely to happen, we have my good friend and colleague, Harry Kazianis of the National Interest. He is currently the Director of National Security Affairs at the Center for National Interest. And it's always a pleasure to have you because, you know, not only do you know most of these players, you've actually worked on some presidential candidates campaigns in the past. You've advised presidents. So I think you have some insight here that are going to be really useful to our audience today. And welcome to the show, Harry.
Thanks, Danny.
Good to have you back again. And let's just jump right into it. So rather than really go across and just like say, all right, here's what everybody said, we're going to kind of talk about the bottom line of what's really important here. And I think the biggest issue, the biggest takeaway is that it's almost doesn't matter what all these people say in terms of how this race is going to go. But I want to highlight a couple of things because there are some important issues that were raised that kind of gives an insight into what at least many in the Republican Party are thinking. We're going to center, first of all, let's take a look at this exchange between Vivek Ramaswamy and Nikki Haley.
What happened to Israel was dead wrong. What Hamas did was medieval. It was subhuman. It was immoral. And we have to call that out for what it is on October 7th. But to say that that was an attack on America fails a basic test. I mean, Nick, if you can't tell the difference between where Israel is and the U.S. is on a map, I can have my 3-year-old son show you the difference. That is irresponsible because it has major consequences, because that doesn't leave room for what actually is an attack on America.
I dealt with Iran every day when I was at the United Nations, and they only respond to strength. What they don't respond to is when you weaken the sanctions like they did on Iran that allowed China to send them billions to fill their proxies. What they don't respond to is when you give $6 billion for 5 hostages. That only makes them want more hostages. What they don't respond to is when they do 140 strikes on our men and women in Syria and Iraq, and we do nothing but just some small shots back. You've got to punch them, you've got to punch them hard, and let them know that. That's the only way they're going to respond. So the way you do that is you go after their infrastructure in Syria and Iraq where they're hitting our soldiers.
You know, it's kind of funny that's kind of some of the same messaging that we've really heard for a long time. The only thing they understand, and you can fill in the blank for who they is, it always changes. The only language they understand is strength and pain and heat. So we got to punch them hard, as she said in that case there. But what's been your experience over time, Harry, especially when it comes to Iran? Are they going to back down, and do they have a history of backing down when they get punched?
Not really. I find the whole exchange kind of amusing because it kind of went in so many different directions. I mean, first for Nikki Haley, look, I give Nikki Haley a lot of credit for taking a lot of shots last night. She looked presidential in the respect that she could take the heat. She could come back with arguments that you may or may not think are reasonable, depending where you sit in the foreign policy spectrum, but she at least sounded a lot more cogent, like she understood the issues, at least from her own sort of neoconservative perspective. She was able to sort of to punch back. And I think that for a lot of Republican voters are going to like that. However, if you sort of dig down a little bit deeper in terms of what she was saying, punch who? Punch them how? If you're going to start talking, bringing Iran into the broader conversation about what's happening with Israel, you need to be able to, within 15 seconds, sort of articulate some sort of strategy when it comes to Iran. She didn't explain why we have forces still in Iraq and Syria. I don't know why. I think you know why either, Danny. I mean, you've been very clear on this yourself. You've been sort of a leader on this issue. Why do we have forces there? What are we deterring? What is their geostrategic objective? I have no idea, but okay, whatever. So we've got these forces out there, and they're obviously a very tempting target for Iranian proxy groups. Well, of course they're going to attack them, and that means we have to have a response. Well, what's the response? We attack a lot of those proxy groups back. Does Nikki Haley want the United States to start bombing Iran? It seems like what she's sort of hinting at.
Right.
I don't really see any.
He was asked that specifically. They said, "Are you saying to bomb Iran?" And she kind of hedged on that. Didn't say. She no. You just got to punch them. And that leads back to the question: what punch? What does that mean? I mean, like you want to get into a boxing match? I mean, what if it's not missiles? What does that mean? How does that look like? And what happens the day after? That's part of the problem that I see is that there's too many people that follow that same line of logic. And I mean, the Lindsey Graham comes first to mind, that he's always wanting to throw a bunch of missiles and rockets in the direction of Iran and hitting the IRGC and all these other kind of things. And they never seem to think about, and then what? What happens next? What do you think Iran would do if some of these, if that actually happened?
I mean, if we bombed inside Iranian territory, I think that takes the whole situation up to a much higher level of escalation. I think the Iranians would strike back, maybe an attack with missiles on Israel. Now, maybe Iron Dome takes those missiles down, but I think that puts us on the track to a broader Middle Eastern war. I mean, does the Iranian Navy start shooting missiles at our aircraft carriers? I mean, there's an open question whether our missile defenses, if they were saturated by even older Iranian missiles from the 1980s, if they'd be able to stop them. So I think this is one of those things.
Mines in the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, there's the speedboats. There's actually quite a few things they could do if pushed into a corner.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's even been studies I've seen, this goes back even 10 years ago, Danny, where the Iranians were playing with the idea of hiding anti-ship ballistic missiles in cargo containers that aren't marked. They would get really close to our warships and fire them at, within 20 or 30 miles, not giving our Aegis platforms or other defensive systems the time to react very quickly. So the Iranians have a whole host of things they can do if they start to think asymmetrically. And this is how this goes very bad and very quickly. But of course, this is what we should expect in some of these GOP debates, sounding tough for sounding tough's sake. And it's just stupid. And this is why a lot of people support Donald Trump to this day, because this is what they don't want.
Yeah, and we're actually going to see some of that in just a second, very graphically, as you just set out here. Want to look at another clip from last night. Also, this is one of the points where I think Ramaswamy actually has a pretty good point here. It's kind of broadly applicable, but I think it might partially apply to himself as well. But in terms of foreign policy wisdom and experience, he had this to say.
Foreign policy experience is not the same as foreign policy wisdom. I want everybody at home to note that I was the first person to say we need a reasonable peace deal in Ukraine. Now a lot of the neocons are quietly coming along to that position, with the exceptions of Nikki Haley and Joe Biden, who still support this, what I believe is pointless war in Ukraine.
Now, to his credit, he also said some other things about the troops in Iraq and Syria. So some of the things he said actually make a lot of sense, but then there's some of the other areas where his lack of experience leads him to say things that may look good on paper, but when you're talking about how they would actually impact on the ground, they're actually not quite as smart. But he does have a good point that just having foreign policy experience, which Nikki Haley has more of than anybody on the stage, does not mean that you have foreign policy wisdom and that some of the things you're saying, like punch Iran, are actually a good idea.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, true foreign policy wisdom is Henry Kissinger, somebody like that. George Shultz in many respects. The list goes on and on. The thing here is this: when we talk about Ukraine, Danny, we've talked about this before on the show and in other formats. What I want to know from the neocons or Joe Biden, hawkish Democrats, whatever, is I think that many Americans support the idea of helping Ukraine. And we can debate what that help looks like, how much arms, maybe no arms. I don't know. We can debate it, but I don't think anybody wants to see Russia cleave off huge sections of Ukraine and in result any sort of win when it comes to that country. Here's where things start to get messy. The Biden administration has given something like $120 billion in aid to Ukraine, and they want to give a lot more. The question I have, and I think every American needs to ask, what are the strategic objectives behind the aid? What is Ukraine planning on doing with that aid? Are they just going to continue pressing on with offensive after offensive with Western military arms and try to slowly claw back territory? I don't know. It doesn't. I mean, there's really no strategy behind it. That's really what bothers me here is that I think the American people need to understand if we're going to go further and further into debt for Ukraine, What is Ukraine's end goal in all this? What is victory? How are we going to get to victory? I'm sick and tired, Danny, of hearing, we have to defeat Vladimir Putin. We have to make sure that Ukraine's territorial integrity is ironclad. But what does that mean? Tell me what it means. I mean, I have a degree from Harvard. I've studied this issue for years and years. I can't tell you what it means, and I do this for a living. So
here's what President Biden actually said on that very subject just a little while ago.
The entire world is watching. What will the United States do? And think if we don't support Ukraine, what's the rest of the world going to do? What's Japan going to do, which is supporting Ukraine now? What's going to happen in terms of the G7? What's going to happen in terms of our NATO allies? What are they going to do? If we walk away now, it'll only embolden other would-be aggressors. So I'm calling on Congress to do something and do the right thing, to stand with the people of Ukraine, stand against the tyranny of Putin, stand for freedom, literally stand for freedom. Let's get this done.
Yeah, see, and to your point there, lots of bumper stickers there, lots of rhetorical questions, which I could answer very graphically in ways that are very different than what he's implying in there. But the thing that he didn't say in there, what is America's vital national interest in here? How many years of this kind of funding are we going to have? How is that money going to go to achieving attainable military objectives or any even political objectives that benefit the United States? And how many years of that are you going to have? We've already given, like you said, somewhere between 110, 115, 20 billion already. That didn't even move the needle, Harry, for a full year in combat. Now, even more than that. And it's going to be definitely less in the next year while Russia's continued to increase. So how are they going to account for the fact that the last tranche didn't change anything and now a smaller tranche is somehow going to do something? Or is he suggesting we need to give this like $60 billion a year into perpetuity? He's not even saying any of those things, because if anybody thinks that by giving this amount of money somehow in a year from now, then we'll be having a victory celebration or something, I don't know. What we're going to get, Harry, is another bill for another $60 billion.
I think so, Danny. And I think the thing is that nobody can say what the end goal is of the Ukraine war is. I mean, obviously, initially back in February 2022 is to stop Putin from marching into Kiev and taking the whole country. Noble goal. I get that. I can get behind that. I think every American can. Nobody wants to see that. However, after that, what is the goal? If then once we have a goal, how are we going to achieve that goal? How much is that goal going to cost? I mean, I hate to keep saying the same thing over and over again, but it's like basic foreign policy 101 that you would read as an undergraduate at any college in the world. And think about it this way. All of the foreign policy mistakes we've made a lot of them since the Vietnam War are really all around the same thing. We are great at getting into wars. We are great at winning the initial battles, but we don't have any grand strategy after that. And what gets me very scared, Danny, and you kind of pointed this out, we can't put foreign policies on bumper stickers and think that that's going to lead some sort of big strategic victory. My real fear, to be honest with you, is that the secret sort of goal behind all this is that if we just put enough pressure on Putin, at least what I think the neocons think, is that somehow that the Russian economy will fall apart and Putin will be deposed. And all of a sudden, we're going to have this wonderful 1991 moment where, Russia suddenly blooms into a democracy and they're our best friends and they join the EU and they join NATO and we all go kumbaya after that. Look, I'd love to see that. That would be great. But it's not going to happen.
That's the real problem with so much of our foreign policy. It's aspirational. It's like it would be really cool if this happened, but there's no fundamental reasons to it and practical steps like George Shultz, like you're talking about. And even though I have a lot of issues with Henry Kissinger, I mean, he certainly knew how to get things done and he understood the reality of what you have to accomplish certain goals. And man, there's just almost none of that these days.
No, it's like a Disney movie. It's just make believe. Like we just use all these little bumper stickers. Like Biden's talking about, we have to fight for freedom. Okay, but that's great. That's a great talking point. But what are we actually going to do? What is the strategy? I mean, is the strategy to kick the Russians out of the Donbass? Is it to kick them out of Crimea? Is it to start marching on Russian territory? Nobody has a clue. And if those are your objectives, we're not giving the Ukrainians anywhere where we would need to do those things. They're not getting the training that they need. They don't even know how to do full combined armed services warfare. I mean, give me a break. I mean, the whole thing is it doesn't make any sense, but it gets the talking point. It gets them in the media cycle for a little while. It looks tough, and the American people just move on. But
the thing is, they move on. But the problem festers because those bumper stickers, those Disney movie sound bites don't actually change anything on the ground. So it's going to still be out there. Now, that has some significant relevance to this issue at hand here and the potential for who's going to be asked to run or who's going to be asked to be the president in the next election. And let's take a look at what Donald Trump actually had to say on this issue of Ukraine.
Some people hear you say you're going to end the war in 24 hours, and they worry that means President Putin is going to get to keep the territory he's unlawfully
I'd make a fair
claimed.
Deal for everybody. Nope. I'd make
Doesn't mean that? Wouldn't be a win for Putin?
That's something that could have been negotiated because there were certain parts, Crimea and other parts of the country, that a lot of people expected could happen. You could have made a deal. So they could have made a deal where there's less territory right now than Russia's already taken, to be honest. And you could have made a deal where nobody was killed. They had a deal. They would have had a Ukraine country. Now nobody even knows if Ukraine is going to be totally taken over.
And look, Harry, let's consider one of the things he's saying there. Now, I'll say at the top here what a candidate says and what they would actually do in the White House, even for someone who's been in the White House, are very often different things. But he is very much on point there. As I wrote for you, actually, in some of your publications several times in the year prior to that war, that there were many off ramps. There were definitely places that the war could have been avoided completely. And a lot of that is because of Disney kind of foreign policy aspirations by the United States in the West. And to say, no, we're not going to, I don't care what anybody says. We're going to keep that door open for Ukraine to come into NATO. And even though Russia has and Ukraine signed these Minsk Accords that could have given, nominal control even over the Donbass to Kiev, and it would have protected the Russian speakers in there. If they had come anywhere close to that, there almost certainly wouldn't have been a war. And then once it started, within 1 month, there was a meeting in Istanbul where they were also really close to having a deal that could have kept the war from expanding any further and kept the casualty counts very, very low. So Trump is right in that, and I don't hear anybody else even talking about that.
No, and I think honestly, I know this might make some people mad, but I think if Trump had been reelected, I don't think there would have been a war in Ukraine, because put yourself in Putin's perspective. I mean, Donald Trump is sort of like a foreign policy maverick. You never know really what he's going to do. You really don't. He doesn't have this ideological perspective that we all sort of have, whether you're a neocon or realist. He doesn't know what any of that stuff is. He sort of just goes by his gut. He looks at the world as it is. I would say he's a realist, but he's sort of like this New York business sort of realist who just sort of tries to figure out what America's interests are and kind of goes from there. Could he sort of end the war in Ukraine? Maybe. I mean, I think Trump would do a lot of things that he sort of did from his North Korea playbook. I think within the first week or so, if he gets reelected in 2025 and takes the Oval Office, he might just get on the phone with Putin and say, look, what the hell are you doing in Ukraine? And, that could be something that would create the impetus for some sort of negotiation that could end the conflict, or I think probably ends up making it some sort of frozen conflict like it was before, bigger, even scarier, but frozen nonetheless. I think that's where we sort of end up with if Trump ends up coming to office.
And look, a lot of people have lots of problems with Trump in many different areas, but I just keep going back to his foreign policy issues here. I think a clip we had on one of our previous recent shows here talked about him, how he would actually, solve the issue here in a little bit more detail than what he did there, because he said he's not interested in quote, winning the war. He was asked, do you want Ukraine to win the war? And he says, I don't even think in those terms. I think let's just end the war. Let's just get the thing done. And look, that's what nobody in America is saying right now. No one's even looking to end the war. All we ever want to talk about is let's support them for as long as it takes, even though militarily there is no path to a military victory. Ergo, all of this money you're giving, all these tanks, planes, artillery shells, all the stuff coming out of our own inventories, it's not going to make any difference. And yet, instead of recognizing that reality, our current crop of leaders and even some of the other Republicans there, no one's saying, let's just acknowledge reality and let's get this done so we stop the war in the possibility for escalation. God help us all if something went sideways and we end up in a war against a nuclear power Russia. I mean, that's absurd that we're even playing with that. But that's one thing that Trump is not afraid to say, yeah, I'm willing to do that. Just get this thing off the table so we can move on to other issues.
Yeah, and I don't even know what victory would look like, or even what that means, Danny. I mean, think about this from this perspective. I mean, other authoritarian countries are now going to Russia's cause and trying to back them. Look at what Iran has done, giving them different drones. Iran is now buying Su-35 fighters from Russia, which upgrades their air force. All of that is because of the Ukraine war. Yeah. Now, all of a sudden, North Korea is selling old ammunition and stockpiles to Russia. And I'm sure that's for some sort of satellite technology, or who knows, maybe they're helping them with their ballistic missile program that'll power their ICBMs. So we have to think of Ukraine, not in terms of wins and losses, but what does the United States gain from ending this conflict?
That's such a big point.
Yeah, and you don't want the war in Ukraine to be this massive ulcer in Europe that creates a lot of other strategic problems for the United States. I mean, we don't want the North Koreans to have more powerful ballistic missile technology because of the Ukraine war. We got to think more broadly.
And, and kind of dovetailing off of that, I mean, you just saw that the Putin went to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, was feted like a king in there. And, when our senior leaders went there, like when we went to Saudi Arabia, the Secretary of State was made to wait for hours for a meeting. They didn't even meet him at the airport, with some of these visits here. I mean, there's some real significant, imagery that's showing, look, they're taking care of Putin. We did not isolate him. All that is because of this war and how we've continued to move in that direction. And now many of the levers we had over Russia, now we've lost because they found other outlets to keep their economy and their energy sales going.
That is, and I do worry long term. A lot of other people have said this, Bridge Colby, a lot of other smart foreign policy thinkers. The long-term thing I am worried about is Russia falling into the arms of China, which has already happened a lot. I mean, just look, for example, at the state of the Chinese military as it stands right now. All of the high-tech goods that the Chinese have built up over the last 20 years have some sort of Russian origin. They're aircraft carriers, all the different types of weapons platforms that they've been able to build. Either they stole from the Russians, built from the Russians, intellectually property stolen from the Russians. I mean, do we really want a situation where Russia is so hobbled after the Ukraine war, their economy so beaten up and destroyed that they have to go to the Chinese hand, where they sell all their oil and natural gas, where you might see some migration of Chinese into Siberia, taking some sort of soft control of some of those provinces and territories that abut close to China. Chinese are talking about this. So I think it's important that we understand that, I don't want to see a powerful Russia, but at the same time, I don't want to see a so weakened Russia.
I do want to see people who are running for the highest office in our country to think beyond the slogans, to think beyond the bumper stickers. Everybody wants to sound tough. I'm so tired of hearing about that. We want to sound tough and we want to punch and whatever else. Nobody's thinking strategically about the next step and the next step and the other four ripples that would come after whatever policy you want to choose. What is the ramifications of that? Like you just laid out. So if you want to run for president, I would vote for you. But I would like to see some other people think about these things and actually have somebody in office, that has some kind of coherent view of the world and can think strategically and not just one checker move forward. That's a real problem, I think.
It is. And I think the problem with some of it is that the way our media is set up, whether it's in op-eds, whether it's on TV. I mean, I love doing those things. I do them all day long. The challenge is they do not lead to any sort of depth, Danny. Things like this, like your show, lead to that depth, lead to those conversations. And I think that's why so many people tune into your show, other platforms like this, because people are starting to realize, the world doesn't fit into a 30-second soundbite. It doesn't fit into 650 words on an opinion post. As important as those things are, the world is a lot more complex than it ever was. And especially when it comes to foreign policy and national security issues, we have to think 4 or 5 steps ahead. If we don't, we're going to end up in an even worse situation than we are now. And
Yeah.
that
And
we don't have the
you know,
strategic room to do that anymore.
I mean, we can say, I'm not trying to make it sound like Trump is a chess master or anything like that, but I think even if it's intuitively, even if he's not actually consciously thinking, all right, my strategic idea on the 12th step, even if he's not thinking that, I think, what you described as kind of his New York intuition, whatever, seems to be, holding him in pretty good stead here. So at least those things are being addressed. However, if you want to call the elephant that is in the room is that will Trump be out of jail when it comes time for the election in November? Because there's a lot of pretty serious charges out there. And in the time we have left, I wonder if you can just briefly describe what you think is the risk of him actually getting convicted of any of these, and what do you think that might do to the electorate if he actually is pulled off the ballot?
This is the thing I feel like the media is sort of sidestepping, and it's not just left or right. I just don't feel like there's enough focus on these 4 indictments, 91 charges that Donald Trump is facing. Now, not all of them result in jail time. Some would be fines, some would be misdemeanors. Who knows how it all shakes out. But, this is the problem for the GOP. And I don't think Republicans are really thinking about what happens if Donald Trump really does have to go to jail and he exhausts all of his, Supreme Court challenges and those type of things. Or God forbid, we end up in a scenario where he is the nominee, he wins the election, but then gets hit with, the possibility of going to jail. And that's when he's in the Oval Office. I mean, we would be facing a constitutional crisis like we have never seen. Yeah, I mean, it's the stuff that would make up a Netflix series. So I think the GOP needs to start really thinking about this. And I think this is why you're seeing all this movement towards Nikki Haley all of a sudden, because they think they figured out that as much as I like Ron DeSantis, I don't think Ron DeSantis is ready for prime time in this moment. Maybe 2028, but I think right now he's got a lot of things he has to work out in terms of organization, how he presents himself to the wider media. He's doing a great job in Florida, but on the national stage, I think we have to face facts. He stumbled. I think this is why so many people are looking at Nikki Haley now as the presumptive backup plan, if you will. But the problem is, of course, MAGA does not like Nikki Haley. Those tens of millions of MAGA voters that Donald Trump brought into the GOP will not back her. So it would take a lot of convincing to sort of move.
That's true. But, I thought it was really interesting dynamic a week or 10 days ago where there was a poll where they were matching up the head-to-heads of the various candidates against Biden. And the GOP person who got the biggest bump was Nikki Haley, even more than Trump did. So maybe she would lose a lot of MAGA people, but if she's the only one left standing and she goes in there, apparently, well, according to those polls, a lot of the independent voters that block in the middle would go for her more than Biden.
Maybe it's so tough to say, Danny, because there's a lot of dynamics there. I mean, in that poll, are we seeing some of those Joe Biden voters now presented with a more palatable choice, considering maybe they're worried about his health or his age issues, moving over to Nikki Haley? Maybe. But also, too, how many MAGA voters would not vote for Nikki Haley? Feeling like like she abandoned Donald Trump, even though back in 2016 she hated Donald Trump, but obviously did the thing that a lot of Republicans did and tried to join Trump because it was better to be inside of the circle than outside of the circle of power.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's so hard to figure out. All I know is the GOP needs to have some sort of backup plan when it comes to Trump, because we have no clue what's going to happen between now and then.
And I guess Trump, yeah, well, I mean, we'll see. I mean, the caucus is just next month, so we're going to get a pretty good idea of what's happening there, and we will definitely be looking back to you to get more of that and continue following this, because this is something that's not going away anytime soon, and we need to have you back on so we can talk more details, about the potential ramifications. We might even do a whole show just on that, because this is a bigger deal that's not getting much coverage anywhere, really, even on some of these other channels. So we appreciate you having you on, and we will have you on back very soon. We're going to let you go for now. We will be back again live here in about 25 minutes, where I'm going to show you some dangerous misinformation coming out of the White House that you need to know about. And it's not pretty, but we'll show you in a minute. We remain unintimidated and uncompromised to give you the truth that you need. We will see you on the next show, Daniel Davis Deep Dive.